Chapter 10 of Genesis provides a genealogical account of the descendants of Noah's three sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. The chapter outlines the various nations and peoples that came from these lineages. Japheth's descendants include Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus, among others. Ham's descendants include Cush, Mizraim, Egypt, Phut, and Canaan. Cush became the father of Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, and others, while Mizraim fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtim, and others. Canaan, the son of Ham, had Sidon, Heth, and other descendants who became the Canaanite nations. A notable figure among Ham's descendants is Nimrod, who was known as a mighty hunter and established cities such as Babel, Erech, and Nineveh. Additionally, the chapter mentions the descendants of Shem, including Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Shem is identified as the father of all the children of Eber, and his descendants are listed. The chapter concludes by stating that these are the families and nations that arose from the sons of Noah after the flood. It emphasizes that these nations were divided among the earth according to their languages, families, lands, and nations. Chapter 11 of Genesis describes the story of the Tower of Babel and the subsequent scattering of humanity across the earth. At that time, all people spoke the same language and lived together in one place. As the people journeyed from the east, they settled in the land of Shinar and decided to build a city and a tower that would reach to heaven. Their intention was to make a name for themselves and prevent being scattered across the earth. They began constructing the tower using brick and slime as mortar. God observed their actions and recognized that their unity and shared language made them powerful. In response, God decided to confuse their language so that they couldn't understand each other. As a result, the people could no longer communicate effectively, and they were scattered across the earth. The city and the tower were left unfinished, and the place became known as Babel, meaning confusion. The chapter then shifts to the genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's sons. It lists the generations from Shem to Terah, the father of Abram, later known as Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Terah had three sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran was the father of Lot. Abram married Sarai, later known as Sarah, but she was unable to conceive. Terah, Abram, Sarai, and Lot left Ur of the Chaldees and headed toward the land of Canaan. They settled in Haran, where Terah later died at the age of 205. In chapter 12 of Genesis, God speaks to Abram, later known as Abraham, and instructs him to leave his country, kindred, and father's house and go to a land that God will show him. God promises to make Abram into a great nation, bless him, make his name great, and make him a blessing. God also declares that those who bless Abram will be blessed, while those who curse him will be cursed. Furthermore, God states that through Abram, all families of the earth will be blessed. Abram obeys God's command and leaves Haran at the age of 75, accompanied by his wife Sarai, later known as Sarah, and his nephew Lot. They take their possessions and the people they had acquired in Haran and journey to the land of Canaan. Along the way, Abram passes through Sichem and the plain of Moreh, where the Canaanites reside. There, God appears to Abram and promises to give that land to his descendants. Abram responds by building an altar to the Lord. Abram continues his journey, moving from place to place in the south. However, a famine strikes the land of Canaan, prompting Abram to go down to Egypt to find sustenance. As they approach Egypt, Abram becomes worried that the Egyptians will kill him because of his wife's beauty. He instructs Sarai to say that she is his sister to ensure his own safety. When they arrive in Egypt, Pharaoh's officials notice Sarai's beauty and praise her to Pharaoh. As a result, Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's house, and Abram is treated well because of her. However, God sends plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai. Pharaoh discovers that Sarai is Abram's wife and confronts Abram about his deception. Pharaoh then allows Abram to take his wife and possessions and sends them away. Thus, chapter 12 of Genesis covers Abram's call, his journey to Canaan, his temporary stay in Egypt, and the testing of Abram and Sarai in Pharaoh's court. In chapter 13 of Genesis, Abram returns from Egypt to the south along with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions. Abram had become wealthy in cattle, silver, and gold during his time in Egypt. He travels back to the place where his tent had been between Bethel and Hai, where he had previously built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. Both Abram and Lot had acquired wealth, and the land couldn't sustain their combined possessions. Strife arises between their herdsmen. Additionally, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land at that time. Abram proposes a solution to Lot, suggesting that they separate to prevent further conflict. Abram generously allows Lot to choose which direction he wants to go. Lot looks toward the well-watered plain of Jordan, which resembled the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Lot decides to settle in the cities of the plain, particularly toward Sodom. After Lot and Abram part ways, the Lord speaks to Abram and tells him to lift up his eyes and survey the land in all directions. God promises to give Abram and his descendants all the land that he sees. God further assures Abram that his descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. God instructs Abram to walk through the land, assuring him that it will be given to him and his descendants. Abram then moves his tent and settles in the plain of Mamre in Hebron. There, he builds an altar to the Lord. In summary, chapter 13 of Genesis recounts Abram's return from Egypt, the separation of Abram and Lot due to their growing wealth, God's promise of the land to Abram and his descendants, and Abram's settlement in Hebron. In chapter 14 of Genesis, a coalition of kings, led by Chedorlaomer, makes war against Bera, king of Sodom, and other kings in the region. These battles take place in the Vale of Siddim near the Salt Sea. For 12 years, the kings of Sodom and the surrounding cities serve Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebel. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his allies attack and defeat various nations and peoples, including the Rephaim, Zuzim, Emim, and Horites. They also conquer the Amalekites and the Amorites. The kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, Zoar, gather their forces to resist, but they are defeated in the Vale of Siddim. Some of them fall into slime pits, while others flee to the mountains. During the battle, Lot, who is Abram's nephew and dwells in Sodom, is captured along with his possessions. However, one survivor escapes and reports the news to Abram, who is living in the plain of Mamre. Abram gathers a force of 318 trained servants born in his household and pursues the captors as far as Dan. By night, Abram divides his forces, attacks the enemy, and successfully rescues Lot, along with all the captured goods, women, and people. After Abram's victory, the king of Sodom comes out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh. At the same time, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, Jerusalem, who is also a priest of the Most High God, brings forth bread and wine. He blesses Abram, acknowledging God as the possessor of heaven and earth. In return, Abram gives Melchizedek a tithe of all the spoils of war. The king of Sodom offers Abram the captured goods, but Abram refuses to accept anything from him, not even a thread or a shoelace, so that the king of Sodom cannot claim to have made Abram rich. However, Abram allows his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, to take their share of the spoils. In summary, chapter 14 of Genesis narrates the battles between the kings of the region and Abram's rescue of his nephew Lot. It also introduces Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who blesses Abram and receives a tithe from him. Abram refuses to accept any reward from the king of Sodom, except for what his allies are entitled to. In chapter 15 of Genesis, Abram has a vision in which the word of the Lord comes to him. God assures Abram not to fear and declares himself as Abram's shield and great reward. Abram expresses his concern about being childless and mentions that his servant, Eliezer of Damascus, is his heir. But God assures Abram that his own biological child will be his heir, not Eliezer. God takes Abram outside and tells him to look at the stars in the sky and try to count them. God promises Abram that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Abram believes in the Lord's promise, and his faith is counted as righteousness. God reminds Abram that he brought him out of Ur of the Chaldees to give him the land they are standing on as an inheritance. Abram asks for a sign to confirm that he will indeed inherit the land. God instructs him to bring specific animals for a sacrifice. Abram follows the instructions, cuts the animals in half, and arranges them, but he does not divide the birds. As Abram waits, birds of prey try to attack the carcasses, but Abram drives them away. As the sun sets, Abram falls into a deep sleep, and a darkness falls upon him. God speaks to Abram in this state and reveals that his descendants will be strangers in a foreign land and will be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. However, God assures Abram that the nation that enslaves them will be judged, and Abram's descendants will come out with great possessions. God also assures Abram that he will die in peace and be buried in old age. God further reveals that it will take 4 generations for Abram's descendants to return to the land they are standing on because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. As the sun sets and darkness falls, Abram sees a smoking furnace and a burning lamp pass between the pieces of the divided animals. On the same day, the Lord establishes a covenant with Abram, promising to give the land to his descendants, extending from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River. The specific nations inhabiting the land at that time are mentioned, including the Kenites, Kensites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. In chapter 16 of Genesis, Sarai, Abram's wife, is unable to bear children. She suggests to Abram that he should have a child with her Egyptian maidservant named Hagar, hoping to obtain children through her. Abram listens to Sarai and takes Hagar as his wife. After Hagar conceives, she begins to despise Sarai. Sarai blames Abram for the situation and complains to him about Hagar's disrespectful behavior. Abram tells Sarai that Hagar is under her authority and that she can deal with her as she sees fit. Sarai mistreats Hagar, causing her to flee. While Hagar is in the wilderness, an angel of the Lord finds her near a fountain of water. The angel asks her where she has come from and where she plans to go. Hagar explains that she is fleeing from Sarai's presence. The angel instructs her to return to Sarai and submit herself to her authority. The angel also promises Hagar that her descendants will multiply greatly and be too numerous to count. He tells her that she will bear a son and instructs her to name him Ishmael because the Lord has heard her affliction. The angel describes Ishmael's future as a wild man, with a contentious nature and a life lived in the presence of his brethren. Hagar acknowledges the presence of the Lord and names him Thou God seest me because she recognizes that he has seen her and cared for her in her distress. The well near which this encounter takes place is named Beer Lahai Roi. Hagar returns to Abram and gives birth to a son named Ishmael. Abram is 86 years old at the time Ishmael is born. In chapter 17 of Genesis, when Abram is 99 years old, the Lord appears to him and commands him to walk before him and be perfect. The Lord establishes a covenant with Abram, promising to multiply him exceedingly. The Lord changes Abram's name to Abraham, signifying that he will be a father of many nations. God promises that Abraham will be fruitful, with nations and kings coming from him. The Lord establishes an everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants, promising to be their God. As a sign of the covenant, the Lord commands Abraham and his descendants to circumcise every male child among them. Circumcision serves as a token of the covenant between God and Abraham. The Lord also changes Sarai's name to Sarah and promises to bless her. He assures Abraham that Sarah will bear him a son named Isaac, and through Isaac, the covenant will be established. Abraham expresses doubt due to his old age and suggests that Ishmael, his son with Hagar, could be the chosen one. However, God confirms that Sarah will indeed bear a son named Isaac, and the covenant will be established through him. God blesses Ishmael as well, promising to make him fruitful and multiply him greatly, with 12 princes coming from him. Abraham obeys God's command and circumcises himself, along with Ishmael and all the males in his household, both those born in his house and those bought with his money. Abraham is 99 years old and Ishmael is 13 years old when they are circumcised, and all the men in Abraham's household undergo the circumcision as well. In chapter 18 of Genesis, Abraham has a visitation from 3 men who are actually holy beings. Abraham welcomes them and offers them hospitality, urging them to rest and refresh themselves. He prepares a meal for them, including a calf, butter, milk, and cakes. During the meal, the visitors ask about Sarah, Abraham's wife. They inform Abraham that Sarah will have a son within a year. Sarah overhears this conversation and laughs within herself because both she and Abraham are old and beyond the age of childbearing. The Lord, who is among the visitors, questions why Sarah laughed and expresses that nothing is too hard for him. He reaffirms that Sarah will indeed have a son at the appointed time. After the meal, the men prepare to leave, and Abraham accompanies them. The Lord ponders whether to hide from Abraham his plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah due to the great outcry against their sin. The Lord acknowledges that Abraham will become a great nation and will command his children and household to keep the way of the Lord. Abraham then intercedes on behalf of the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, asking if the Lord would spare the cities if 50 righteous people were found there. The Lord agrees to spare the cities for the sake of 50 righteous individuals. Abraham continues to plead, suggesting progressively smaller numbers, and the Lord agrees not to destroy the cities for the sake of even 10 righteous individuals. After the conversation, the Lord departs, and Abraham returns home. Chapter 19 of Genesis recounts the story of Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, who is now living in Sodom, encounters 2 angels who come to the city in the evening. Lot invites them to stay at his house for the night and offers them hospitality. However, the wicked men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring out the angels so they can engage in immoral acts with them. Lot tries to reason with them and even offers his own daughters instead, but the men persist in their wickedness. The angels intervene and strike the men with blindness, protecting Lot and his guests. The angels then inform Lot that they have been sent to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their great wickedness. The next morning, the angels urge Lot to take his wife and 2 daughters and flee the city to escape its destruction. Lot hesitates, so the angels take hold of his hand and lead him out of the city. They warn him not to look back as they flee and to escape to the mountains. Lot pleads with them to allow him to go to a nearby small city called Zoar instead, and the angels grant his request. As Lot and his family reach Zoar, the Lord rains down brimstone and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah, completely destroying the cities and their inhabitants. Lot's wife, however, disobeys the instruction not to look back and turns into a pillar of salt. After witnessing the destruction, Abraham, who had interceded with the Lord on behalf of the righteous in the cities, sees the smoke rising from the area where Sodom and Gomorrah once stood. Lot is afraid to stay in Zoar, so he and his daughters retreat to a cave in the mountains. The daughters, thinking that there are no men left on the earth, devise a plan to become pregnant by their father. They make Lot drink wine and each daughter sleeps with him on separate nights, resulting in them both becoming pregnant. The firstborn daughter gives birth to a son named Moab, who becomes the ancestor of the Moabite people. The younger daughter gives birth to a son named Ben-Ami, who becomes the ancestor of the Ammonite people.